It was a rainy, gloomy night in Atlanta, and the sound of rain hitting the windows of Jonathan Reed's apartment seemed to be a foreshadowing of the tragedy that was about to unfold. The city was accustomed to its frenetic pace, but that night, an event that seemed like a simple family disagreement was about to turn into a nightmare of violence and chaos. Jonathan Reed, a 32-year-old man, was relaxing in his living room after a tiring day at work. He had planned a peaceful night away from the tensions of the office, only to be interrupted by an unexpected phone call. On the other end of the line was his wife, Laura, who was out of town on business. The conversation started like any other, with updates about work and the plan for the weekend. But towards the end of the conversation, Laura mentioned a problem that had been weighing on her mind. Her mother, Helen Thompson, was insisting on visiting their house that night. Jonathan knew Helen well. The relationship between him and his mother-in-law had always been complicated, marked by an underlying tension that never seemed to completely disappear. Helen was a domineering and controlling woman, whose visits were often a challenge to the balance of Jonathan and Laura's relationship. Laura tried to deal with the situation diplomatically, but conflicts between her mother and her husband were a constant source of stress. Laura tried to downplay the impact of her mother's visit, explaining that Helen just wanted to discuss some family issues that could be resolved quickly. Jonathan, although reluctant, agreed to take Helen in, believing that a quick conversation could avoid a major conflict in the future. What Jonathan didn't know was that that night would become the beginning of a nightmare that would change his life forever. When Helen arrived, the atmosphere in the apartment was already charged with tension. Helen entered with a determined expression, carrying a large bag, which would later prove crucial to the investigation. The initial interaction between Helen and Jonathan was marked by a series of teasing and arguments that would quickly escalate into an out-of-control situation. Neighbors heard the start of the argument, but had no idea of the severity of what was unfolding. What started as a trivial argument about family matters quickly turned into a heated fight. The conversation degenerated, and the violence that soon erupted was the culmination of months of accumulated tension. Helen, who had previously demonstrated obsessive and controlling behaviors towards Jonathan, was clearly prepared for a confrontation. Investigators later discovered that she had arrived at the apartment with the intention of resolving personal issues in a way that went beyond mere disagreement. The bag Helen carried contained items that were part of her preparation for the night, including an object that was used during the violence that followed. Inside the apartment, the situation deteriorated quickly. Jonathan, who initially tried to remain calm and resolve the situation peacefully, soon found himself struggling to defend himself. The crime scene revealed signs of a violent physical confrontation. Furniture was displaced, and the floor was covered with evidence of a desperate struggle. The scene was a reflection of an intense and brutal battle, a confrontation that ended up leading to an irreversible tragedy. When police arrived at the scene, they found Jonathan unconscious and seriously injured. The situation was chaotic, and the evidence pointed to an act of extreme violence. Helen was immediately identified as the main suspect, and her behavior during the investigation was a mixture of nervousness and an attempt to hide the truth. The beginning of that fateful night, which seemed simple and routine, turned out to be the beginning of a deep and disturbing nightmare. What should have been a harmless family argument turned into a tragic and violent event, the repercussions of which would deeply affect everyone involved. The case of Jonathan Reed began to gain notoriety, and the city of Atlanta was about to be confronted with a story of obsession, control, and violence that defied comprehension. As Jonathan Reed's case progressed, investigations began to focus on an element that, until then, seemed like just a disturbing detail: Jonathan's mother-in-law, Helen Thompson. Helen's increasingly obsessive behavior revealed a dark and unsettling complexity that was beginning to gain prominence in the investigation. Helen Thompson, a 56-year-old woman, had always demonstrated an unsettling presence in Jonathan and Laura's lives. With a domineering personality and a penchant for meddling, Helen often crossed the boundaries of what would be considered appropriate for a mother-in-law. Helen's relationship with Jonathan was not just strained. It was marked by a disturbing obsession that was beginning to be unearthed by investigators. Helen had a peculiar way of expressing her affection, which seemed more like a form of control than genuine affection. Neighbors and friends reported that she often showed up at the couple's home without warning, often at inopportune times. The frequency of his visits, combined with a series of expensive and unnecessary gifts, began to raise suspicions. Helen had a habit of sending flowers, jewelry, and even expensive clothes to Jonathan, always with a justification that seemed more like an attempt to mark territory than to offer a gift. Helen's behavior was not limited to her visits and gifts. She also engaged in excessive and invasive conversations with Jonathan, often discussing personal aspects of her life that should be private. She seemed to know intimate details about Jonathan and Laura's relationship, and her observations and comments were often filled with a possessive and controlling tone. Helen's obsession was not an isolated phenomenon. It manifested itself in an ongoing pattern of behavior. Helen seemed to be constantly looking for ways to infiltrate the couple's lives, often disregarding boundaries and privacy. It was clear that his presence was not just a nuisance. It was a source of increasing discomfort for Jonathan. Laura Reed, Jonathan's wife, began to realize that her mother's behavior was going beyond acceptable limits. She felt caught between the desire to protect her marriage and the pressure of dealing with Helen's constant presence. Laura tried several times to limit her mother's presence in their home, but Helen's insistence only intensified. Helen seemed to view her constant presence in her life as a way of maintaining control, and her obsession was becoming a source of increasing tension. Helen's behavior did not go unnoticed by investigators. As they examined the crime scene and gathered statements, the image of an obsessive and controlling mother-in-law began to crystallize. Police found records of Helen's incessant messages and calls to Jonathan, many of which were possessive and manipulative in tone. This evidence began to paint a clear picture of a troubled mind and a relationship marked by a destructive desire for control. Helen's obsession with Jonathan seemed to be rooted in a desire to maintain her influence over her daughter's life and, by extension, Jonathan himself. Helen saw Jonathan not just as a son-in-law but as an intruder in her life and her family. And this distorted view led her to increasingly extreme behavior. As the investigation delved deeper into the darker aspects of Helen's life, it became clear that her obsession was not just a matter of family disagreements. It was a manifestation of unhealthy control and possessiveness that would culminate in an act of brutal violence. Helen was willing to go to extreme lengths to regain what she saw as her authority and influence over the lives of her daughter and son-in-law. Helen Thompson's obsession was not just a feature of her personality, it was a crucial factor in resolving the case. As more details about his behavior became public, the Atlanta community began to understand the depth of the nightmare that had unfolded in the shadows. The case of Jonathan Reed became not only a personal tragedy, but a disturbing example of the dangers of an unchecked obsession. What appeared to be a story of a simple family disagreement turned out to be, in fact, a case of obsessive control and violence. Helen's obsession with Jonathan, which initially seemed a matter of discomfort, turned out to be a destructive force that led to an act of irreparable murder. What was unfolding was a frightening example of how possessiveness and control can turn into tragedy. On the night of March 25, 2023, the case of Jonathan Reed went from a personal tragedy to an enigma of shocking and brutal violence. Tensions had increased significantly, and Helen Thompson's constant presence in Jonathan's life was beginning to have devastating consequences. The stage was set for the final unfolding of the tragedy that had been brewing. The situation in Jonathan's apartment, where the crime had occurred, was a grim reflection of the unfolding confrontation. Investigators had spent days examining the crime scene and gathering evidence. The apartment was in complete disarray, with furniture moved and items scattered everywhere, signaling an intense and desperate struggle. That night, Jonathan was home alone. Laura, his wife, had gone on a work trip, leaving him alone in the apartment. Helen Thompson, the obsessive mother-in-law, had shown up unexpectedly, claiming she needed to discuss urgent family matters. The police discovered that this visit was not a coincidence. It was the culmination of an obsession that was about to explode into violence. Helen had been seen leaving her home that night looking determined and carrying a bag that would later be identified as containing items related to the crime. She entered Jonathan's apartment under the pretense of resolving family matters, but her true purpose was much darker. The relationship between Helen and Jonathan had deteriorated to the point where any attempt at communication turned into open and violent conflict. What occurred that night is a testament to the escalation of an obsession into an act of violence. Neighbors reported hearing screams and sounds of fighting coming from Jonathan's apartment. The violence appeared to have been extreme, with evidence that Jonathan had tried desperately to defend himself. The crime scene was a mix of chaos and suffering, with clear signs of a brutal physical confrontation. When police arrived at the scene was disturbing. Jonathan was unconscious, seriously injured, and with evidence of multiple attacks. Investigators found clear signs that there had been an intense fight. Helen's presence in the apartment and the evidence of her interactions with Jonathan led the police to focus their attention on her as the main suspect. Helen was found hours later at her home in what appeared to be clearly disturbed behavior. The police questioned her about her presence in Jonathan's apartment and the circumstances that led to the crime. Helen initially tried to deny any involvement, but evidence began to pile up against her. Call and message records, in addition to physical evidence found at the crime scene, pointed directly to his participation. During interrogation, Helen began to reveal disturbing details about her mind and motivations. She described an unhealthy relationship with Jonathan, marked by an obsessive desire for control and influence. Her obsession, which had previously seemed merely bothersome and invasive, was now clearly linked to an act of murder. Helen confessed that her behavior was an attempt to regain control over what she saw as an invasion of her family authority. The case of Jonathan Reed, which began as a family dispute, quickly became a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. The violence that occurred that night revealed the depth of Helen's obsession and its lethal consequences. The investigation revealed a pattern of disturbing behavior and an unbalanced mind that culminated in an act of brutality that shocked the Atlanta community. As Jonathan and Helen's story unfolded, the town was left in a state of shock. The case not only highlighted the dangers of obsession and control, but also served as a grim reminder of the devastating consequences that can arise when these behaviors are taken to the extreme. As the month of April began, Jonathan Reed's case was approaching its conclusion. The city of Atlanta was on edge, closely following each development in a case that had exposed the depths of obsession and violence. With the arrest of Helen Thompson and the beginning of the legal process, the final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. After Helen's confession, investigators deepened their analysis of the case, gathering all the details necessary for the prosecution. Helen was formally charged with first-degree murder, and the case began to be widely covered in the media. The community was shocked by the revelation that a mother-in-law could be involved in such a brutal crime against her son-in-law. The case became a topic of discussion throughout the city and beyond. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including family, friends, and community members seeking to understand what led a seemingly ordinary woman to commit such a violent act. Helen Thompson's trial promised to reveal not only the circumstances of her crime, but also the disturbing psychology behind her actions. During the trial, the prosecutor presented a compelling case, supported by solid evidence and disturbing testimony. The presentation of evidence, which included call logs, messages, and the crime scene, showed a clear pattern of obsessive and violent behavior. Helen's defense tried to argue that she was mentally unstable at the time of the crime, but the evidence demonstrated meticulously calculated behavior. Helen was confronted with her actions, and her behavior during the trial was a reflection of the emotional complexity involved in the case. She showed remorse at times, but also seemed unable to fully understand the gravity of her actions. His statements and testimonies revealed a disturbed mind, consumed by a desire for control and an obsession that transcended all logic. Laura Reed, Jonathan's wife, had to face the difficult task of testifying against her mother. In her statement, Laura spoke about her complicated relationship with Helen and the devastating impact that the loss of Jonathan had on her life. Laura's pain and suffering were palpable, and her testimony was a pivotal moment in the trial, helping to humanize the victim and show the extent of the tragedy that had unfolded. After weeks of testimony and presentations of evidence, the jury deliberated. Helen Thompson's final verdict was guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing was a mix of relief and sadness for the Atlanta community. Helen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a reflection of the seriousness of the crime she committed. The outcome of the Jonathan Reed case was a moment of closure for everyone involved, but it also left a lasting mark. The tragedy had exposed the hidden violence and obsession that can manifest itself in family relationships. The loss of Jonathan was a painful lesson in the dangers of possessiveness and control, and the impact of his death reverberated deeply throughout the community. Laura Reed, despite her mother's condemnation, faced the future with a mixture of sadness and determination. Her life would never be the same, but she was committed to finding a path to healing and preserving Jonathan's memory. The city of Atlanta was also marked by this tragic event, remembering Jonathan and the violence that can hide in the shadows of family relationships. The case of Jonathan Reed and Helen Thompson is a grim reminder that obsession and control can have devastating consequences. The outcome brought some sense of justice, but the pain of loss and the scars left by the tragedy continued to impact everyone who was touched by this disturbing story.